At that point in time, Noel Redding said the Hendrix band was as green as fresh grass, hypnotized by big promises and bigger lies about fame and fortune. He remembered himself as just a kid barely 20 stepping into a whirlwind. One day you were a young musician in worn-out boots. The next you were being told we're going to be huge by people who never picked up a guitar, but somehow controlled every stage you walked onto. For more than half a century the world was told that Jimi Hendrix died alone in a quiet London flat. That version of events sat there untouched, repeated so often, it hardened into something that looked like fact. It stayed that way until Noel Redding, the man who had shared stages, hotel rooms, and secrets with Jimi, finally broke his silence and cracked that story wide open. What he was said to have revealed didn't just shake fans. It rattled anyone who thought they already knew how legends die. Noel insisted that Jimi didn't simply drift away in his sleep. He claimed Jimi was silenced. According to Noel, a powerful figure had slowly wrapped its hands around Jimi's life, tightening its grip on his money, his travel, and even his personal safety. It was said that this control never looked violent from the outside, only organized and efficient. And on the night of September 17, the 1970, Jimi supposedly told Noel something that would follow him like a ghost for the rest of his life. If anything happens to me tonight, it won't be an accident. Noel carried that sentence through the years like a curse he couldn't put down. Before he died in 2003, he reportedly decided he couldn't keep it buried any longer. He began naming names, hinting at motives, and laying out a missing timeline he believed had been ignored from the very beginning. But most people looked away. The fragments he left behind were darker than anything in the official record. Every tragedy begins somewhere with a detail so small it barely seems important until time passes, and that tiny crack is the only place the truth can still be seen. According to long-circulating rumors in rock circles, that moment came at exactly 11:18 p.m. on September 17, the 1970, when Noel's phone rang in a quiet London flat. The sound of that bell, people said, sliced through the stillness like a warning. Whatever peace Noel had that night ended the second he picked up. Later Noel would say it never sounded like a normal call. It sounded like an alarm. Jimi's voice, usually easy and warm, carried a tremor strong enough to push Noel up out of his chair before he even knew why. According to those Noel confided in, Jimi didn't bother with hello, didn't waste a second on small talk. He spoke fast, nearly out of breath, like a man trying to outrun something he couldn't see. "Noel," he supposedly whispered, "they're closing in. I'm not staying here tonight." Those 7 words refused to fade. It was said that Noel repeated them over and over in the years that followed, sometimes angry, sometimes shaken, sometimes almost whispering them to himself, but always convinced they meant more than anyone wanted to admit. Friends later described the way Noel spoke about that call. To them, he didn't sound like a man remembering a scare. He sounded like a man replaying a warning he failed to stop. People close to Noel said he always described Jimi as sounding hunted. When Noel supposedly asked who they were, Jimi dodged the question. He broke his thoughts into short, nervous bursts, dropping his voice as if the line itself might be tapped, or someone might be listening from the next room. Rumors claimed Jimi told him his passport was missing, taken from him without a real explanation. It was believed that this was meant to keep him from flying to New York for a private meeting nobody else was supposed to know about. Whispers inside the industry suggested Jimi had been trying to slip out of a deal he never truly wanted to sign in the first place, and that someone didn't intend to let him walk away quietly. Some versions of the story say Noel heard muffled voices leaking through the receiver, sharp and impatient, like an argument happening just around the corner. Other versions insist he heard a door slam hard before Jimi lowered his voice even further and said, "I don't think I'm supposed to be talking right now." One roadie later claimed that when Noel finally hung up the phone, his face had gone pale as chalk. According to this story, Noel began pacing the room in tight, frantic lines, muttering the same sentence again and again. "Something's wrong. He's not safe tonight." The roadie said Noel looked split in two, one part ready to bolt out the door and race across the city, the other frozen in place, wondering if calling the police would make things worse instead of better. In the end, fear pinned him to the ground. He did nothing, and that inaction, it was said, haunted him for the rest of his life. At nearly the same time, another thread of rumor began to unspool. This one came from a young woman staying 2 floors above Jimi at the Samarkand Hotel. Years later, she claimed that around 11:45 p.m., she heard an argument bleeding through the walls. One of the voices, she believed, was Jimi's, calm at first, then sharper, then breaking under pressure. The other belonged, in her account, to an older man in his 50s, someone whose voice felt out of place in that hallway, like he had stepped in from another world entirely. She said she couldn't make out the actual words, only the pattern: accusation, denial, pleading, and then a sudden suffocating silence. She described it as standing just outside a storm, close enough to feel the air change, but too far to see what was happening inside. According to the stories that followed, the older man was never identified. His name, if it existed on paper at all, never appeared in any hotel record. But the memory of that argument, real or imagined, stayed with her long after the rain stopped and the night moved on without a sound. According to the stories that spread later, the older man in that argument was never officially identified. His name, if it was ever written down, never appeared in any hotel log. Staff reportedly said no one fitting his description had checked in that night. And yet, multiple witnesses swore they had seen a man just like him earlier that afternoon, wearing a dark coat, standing close to Jimi's door, not moving, not speaking, just watching the hallway, like he was waiting for something or someone to happen. Back on Noel's end of the phone line, the tension only climbed. The rumors say Jimi finally said something that made Noel's stomach twist. "They want me to sign something." He supposedly confessed something wrong, something I didn't agree to. Noel was believed to have begged him to get out of the hotel immediately, to grab a cab, to walk, to just leave and find somewhere safe. Jimi reportedly agreed at first, but then Noel heard him pause. The silence on the other side of the line felt heavier than words. Noel could hear the shift in Jimi's breathing, slow at first, then thick with fear. Then came the sentence Noel would never forget: "I don't think they'll let me go." Some versions of the story say Jimi's voice cracked on the word "let," like he understood he'd already gone too far. Others insist he sounded resigned, like a man who had already seen the end of the road and knew it was closer than anyone else realized. The call ended without a goodbye, without even the clean click of the receiver. It was just gone. One second Jimi was there, the next he wasn't. Noel later told people he kept staring at the phone long after the line went dead, as if it might ring again and reverse what he'd just heard. He described feeling a weight in the room, a pressure that had nothing to do with substances or bad decisions. Years later, he reportedly told a journalist that Jimi hadn't been running from himself that night. He was running from people. Another rumor surfaced from a London taxi driver who claimed he saw Jimi standing on the steps outside the Samarkand in the early hours. The driver remembered Jimi glancing over his shoulder again and again, lighting a cigarette with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. He said Jimi dropped his lighter twice before finally getting the flame. He looked scared, the driver allegedly told friends. Not out of control, just scared. By around 12:30 a.m., the mood around Jimi seemed to shift again. A neighbor later claimed she noticed a tall shadow passing across his window, slow, deliberate, almost like someone was pacing inside. She said she heard a dull thud, then nothing. For years, she convinced herself it must have been furniture or someone stumbling, the kind of late-night noise you learn to ignore in an old building. But once the rumors began to stack up, that small sound stopped feeling harmless. When people began stitching all of these fragments together, a darker picture took shape: pressure building, in private, fear spreading beneath the surface, a man who no longer felt safe where he was supposed to be resting. A story began to form, one that suggested Jimi was not alone in those final hours, no matter what the official reports later claimed. By the time the world woke up to the news that Jimi Hendrix was gone, friends said Noel didn't react with shock the way everyone else did. He reacted like someone who had heard the ending before the final chapter was written. According to those close to him, his face didn't show disbelief. It showed recognition. To Noel, that call at 11:18 p.m. hadn't just been a bad moment. It had felt like a goodbye he refused to accept until it was too late. Rumor circles often say that every mystery has a single stretch of time where everything falls apart, a window where the official story and the whispered version pull as far apart as they ever will. For Jimi Hendrix, those same rumors point to the 90 minutes between just after 2 a.m. and nearly 3:30 a.m. on September 18, 1970. Official reports claim Jimi spent those hours alone in the flat. Noel Redding always insisted that version never made sense. Too many sounds, too many sightings, too many details that refused to sit neatly on a typed page. According to neighbors who spoke years later, the first strange moment came at around 2:05 a.m. A black van reportedly rolled slowly into Lansdowne Crescent, its engine barely audible. One woman said she was awake by chance, leaning toward her open window for fresh air, when she noticed the vehicle parked under a street lamp. What caught her attention wasn't the color or the make. It was the license plate. There wasn't one. Just an empty frame flashing back the streetlight like a blank eye. Two men were said to have stepped out, tall and rigid, both wearing dark coats despite the mild weather. They didn't talk, didn't look around, didn't hesitate. Witnesses claimed they walked straight into the building, as if they already knew the layout, as if they'd been there before. The official report made no mention of any van at all. But in the underground stories, the detail never went away. And what people say happened next was even more unsettling. Between roughly 2:14 and 2:40 a.m., 3 different residents reportedly described hearing disturbing noises. Heavy footsteps pounded down the hallway, crossing and recrossing like someone pacing hard. Furniture seemed to drag across the floor, the sound of wood scraping against wood. At least 2 loud thuds were said to have shaken thin walls and rattled old fixtures. A young couple across the courtyard later said they heard a man's voice, strained and muffled, pleading, "Stop. Please just stop." They argued quietly about whether to call for help, or to knock on someone's door, or to mind their own business, the way most people do in a city where trouble is never far away. In the end, they did nothing. No one stepped in. No one interfered. According to Noel's later retellings, that was the part that haunted him most once he learned about it. He believed those sounds were not random. They weren't just another late-night argument. In what he called the real timeline, they were part of something deliberate, a sequence the world was never supposed to piece together. Rumor says Noel once told a journalist that if Jimi was struggling with anything during those minutes, it wasn't sleep. It was survival. Witnesses also recalled that once the noise stopped, the building fell into a kind of silence that didn't feel natural. This quiet reportedly started a little after 2:40 a.m. and stretched for nearly 40 minutes. No footsteps, no voices, not even the usual creaks and pipes that make old buildings feel alive in the dark. Residents later described it as a suffocating stillness, the kind that feels imposed rather than accidental. Some conspiracy circles ended up giving it a name, the dead interval, the window where they believed whatever truly happened to Jimi took place, while the rest of the street slept through it. Then shortly after 3:20 a.m., something shifted again. No one who later spoke about it could say exactly what changed, only that the atmosphere felt different. By 3:35 a.m., the same neighbor who had spotted the van earlier claimed she heard a soft engine turn over. When she pulled her curtain aside, she said she saw that same black van ease away from the curb. It moved slowly, carefully, like whoever was driving it was trying to avoid every bump in the road. 2 silhouettes sat inside their faces, turned forward, their heads never moving toward the windows. They didn't seem to speak, didn't react to anything outside. Once again, no official report ever mentioned it. According to those who told the story, the van slipped into the early London fog and never appeared on that street again. In Noel's version of events, he always circled back to those 90 minutes. He reportedly believed that was when Jimi truly died, not at the time stamped in the official paperwork. According to rumors, Noel became convinced that everything between 2:05 and 3:35 a.m. had been scrubbed, rearranged, and rewritten to sell a simpler story to the public. The timeline, he said, felt polished, almost too convenient for a man whose life had rarely been quiet or simple. In the underground Hendrix lore that grew around his words, those details formed a pattern people found hard to ignore. A van with no plates at 2:05, pleas for help between 2:14 and 2:40. An unnatural silence wrapping the building until after 3:20, and a quiet departure at 3:35 that never made it onto any official record. Whether those details were accurate memories or just the shape grief took over time, they refused to fade. They continued to feed the belief that the final chapter of Jimi Hendrix's life wasn't about chaos or random tragedy. It was, some people claimed, a story edited in the dark and presented to the world as a neat ending. People like to believe that legends fall because of chaos, excess, or their own private demons. It's an easier story to live with. But according to the rumors that followed Noel into his later years, what sealed Jimi's fate wasn't substances or recklessness, or one bad night spiraling out of control. It was business, cold, calculated business. If the second chapter of this story is those 90 minutes when everything went silent, then the third is about the pressure Noel believed pushed Jimi straight toward that silence. As the story is often told, everything shifted in early September 1970, when Jimi finally made a decision he'd been dodging for months. He was going to break with his manager. Noel reportedly told friends this wasn't just speculation or backstage gossip. Jimi spoke plainly about it. During a quiet moment backstage on September 14, surrounded by cigarette smoke and the low hum of amplifiers, Jimi supposedly lowered his voice and said, "I won't be controlled anymore. I'm leaving him." Noel later said he had never seen Jimi look so certain and so drained at the same time, tired of being pulled like a puppet through contracts he didn't fully understand. According to rumors, the motive wasn't about hurt feelings. It was about money. Whispers in the industry claimed Jimi had discovered a massive hole in his earnings, somewhere around $2.1 million in unpaid royalties, a figure that would amount to many millions today. People who repeated the story said Jimi paced the room while he vented to Noel, saying he felt betrayed, manipulated, and squeezed by a system he no longer trusted. He wanted out. And this time he wasn't planning to keep quiet. Noel later called that moment the fatal decision. He said you could almost feel the air shift when Jimi said those words, like the temperature in the room dropped a few degrees. It was as if the choice itself carried consequences neither of them could fully see yet. 2 days later, on September 16, the rumors claimed Jimi had a confrontation that shattered whatever calm he had left. According to whispers that never made their way into official files, Jimi faced his manager in a showdown that changed everything. No formal witness ever stepped forward. No signed statement. No report. But one studio engineer later swore he overheard fragments of the encounter through a hallway door. He described voices raised and cut short, long stretches of heavy silence, and then a single sentence delivered so cold it made the air feel thinner. "If you walk away from me, you won't walk anywhere." The engineer said the whole building seemed to lock up when that line was spoken. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't wild or uncontrolled. It came out calm, like a warning dressed up as a promise. He later admitted he thought about pulling Jimi aside afterward, telling him to stay away from certain people, to watch his back. But he